In this brief ed puzzle, we are going to look at some of the minority groups during the Revolutionary War. We're going to start with the free African Americans and slaves at the beginning of the Revolutionary War. At the beginning of the Revolutionary War, about 1/5 of the population in the 13 colonies was of African descent. People of African descent meant people who were from Africa or their parents were from Africa. Most of them were slaves. Before the war, even free African Americans did not enjoy equal rights. When the war started, dozens of African Americans in Massachusetts volunteered to fight. But the Continental Congress soon passed a law to prevent free African Americans from being allowed to join the Continental Army. They weren't allowed to join, and here's why. The Southern delegates in the Continental Congress from the Carolinas and Georgia, who were pro-slavery, were afraid that allowing African Americans to join the Continental Army might lead to equal treatment of free African Americans and might weaken slavery. So George Washington, as the commander-in-chief, at first needed troops and accepted free African Americans as soldiers, but later, after the law was passed, he agreed to follow that law. However, individual colonies, such as Massachusetts and Rhode Island, had their own militias, and they would accept free African Americans as volunteers into the militias. So they were allowed to fight in the different militias of free states, but they were not allowed to fight in the Continental Army, which represented all 13 colonies. Some of those states even recruited some slaves, and then the slaves were given freedom at the end of the war. George Washington and the Continental Army did not accept militia that had the African Americans, just because they decided that they needed to follow the law to satisfy those southern colonies. But the British Army saw this as an opportunity, and they had a plan to harm the colonial economy and get some more British army men into their troops. So what they would do is they would offer enslaved African Americans to come over to the British side. So in October of 1775, the British Royal Governor of Virginia, for example, which was a slave state in the southern colonies, issued a proclamation that offered freedom to all male slaves if they escaped from their masters and joined the British side. So if we go back and look at these pictures, we can see that there are some African Americans who are dressed in Revolutionary War garb from the colonist side, and those are people who would have fought in the militias in the northern colonies and the New England colonies. But you can also see that there was African Americans who fought for the British side alongside the redcoats as well. Now let's look at the women of the Revolutionary War. Women were also considered a minority group, and they were not recruited to join in the army, but they did help in other ways. Women played supportive roles in the war effort. Most women stayed on the farms while their husbands, brothers, and fathers went off to be soldiers. So besides doing all of their regular jobs, women were left in charge of all the farm work. They prepared the fields, planted the crops, hired temporary workers, harvested and sold the crops. Abigail Adams, who was John Adams' wife, John Adams, who later became one of our presidents, Abigail Adams became famous for her skill in managing the family farm during the war. She did a really great job with that. Some women went to the military camps, even though they weren't really allowed to fight, and they decided to help the army in other ways. George Washington was reluctant. He didn't really like having women at the camps. He felt that they slowed down the army in its marches, but he changed his mind when he saw that they were helpful as cooks, washerwomen, and nurses. And if women had not performed those tasks, then men would have to do that instead of fighting, which would make the size of the army smaller. Other women, very brave women, actually became spies, and they would bring British information over to the colonist side or even help colonist prisoners escape from the British jails. Elizabeth Burgin was one of those people. She helped colonists escape from a British jail in New York. She had to flee for her life when the British officials found out what she had done. A few women did fight on the battlefield, One of them was Deborah Sampson. Another one that's very famous was Mary McCauley, but she is later known as Molly Pitcher. She took her husband's place at the cannon when her husband was killed. So she stepped up when he was shot down. And you can see a picture of Molly Pitcher right here, taking over as the artilleryman in that position. Okay. And that's the facts that we have as far as those two minority groups during the Revolutionary War.